The livestock auction was in full swing when everyone noticed. Not because of the animal stepping onto the platform. It was just an old cow, emaciated, with ribs protruding like prison bars. Not because of the opening bid. Nobody was really interested, but because of the couple who raised their hand. David and Susan Mitchell. Simple names, simple people, at a sprawling cattle auction in rural Montana where everyone knew everyone and judged each other like it was a competitive sport. The laughter started low, then exploded. Comments spread like wildfire. "They've lost their minds!" "Throwing money away!" "That cow can barely stand! Look at her!" The auctioneer frowned, uncomfortable. Even he seemed to question why anyone would pay good money for that pathetic creature. But David and Susan exchanged a glance that nobody else in that arena could interpret. Because what they knew, what that animal really was, nobody could have imagined. Not yet. If you enjoy stories that show how life can surprise you when no one else believes it, subscribe to the channel now. Because here, each story has a lesson that can change the way you see the world. And if you don't want to miss the ending of this story and discover what really existed in that well, activate the notification bell and stay until the end. The livestock auction barn at Rocky Mountain Livestock Exchange wasn't fancy. The wooden walls, weathered by decades of Montana wind and rain, sweated the smell of hay and manure, an aroma that for ranchers meant business, opportunity, future. For David Mitchell, at 58 years old, it meant everything. He stood there with Susan, his wife of 25 years, positioned at the back of the barn alongside maybe 200 other people. Most were established ranchers, owners of sprawling operations that stretched across thousands of acres. There were also speculators, the kind of men who bought and sold animals purely for profit, never getting their hands dirty with actual ranch work. And there were curious onlookers, neighbors who came for the spectacle of the transactions. David chewed his thumbnail nervously while watching animals being paraded across the platform. There were massive bulls that drew whistles of admiration, their muscles rippling like geography. There were prize-winning dairy cows whose bloodlines traced back to expensive European imports, cows that commanded prices in the tens of thousands. There were young calves still full of potential, coveted by various ranchers willing to spend fortunes. He and Susan had been saving for years, 7 years to be exact. Quiet savings squeezed from their modest veterinary supply business. Money set aside from vacations skipped, dinners out eliminated, every penny scraped together for a single audacious purpose that nobody in their right mind would support. The auctioneer's voice boomed through the speakers, rhythmic and professional. "Lot 42, outstanding genetics here, folks. Proven bloodline, documented pedigree, excellent production history." David barely heard it anymore. He was waiting, watching. Susan, beside him, held her breath. She recognized that expression on David's face. The same expression he'd worn the night he'd proposed to her when she thought he was going to ask her to move into his parents' house. That was the look of someone who knew something. More lots passed. Prices climbed. Hands shot up. Excited shouts echoed when someone overpaid for an animal. The auction's rhythm was simple. Supply, demand, greed. Repeat. Then it came. "Lot 67. We have a special animal here, ladies and gentlemen. Holstein dairy cow, 9 years old with registered..." But the auctioneer stopped. His eyes blinked, confused. Because the creature being guided toward the platform wasn't exactly special. She was thin, not athletically lean. Thin in a way that made people concerned. Her ribs were visible even from the back of the barn, sharp protrusions under skin that was matted with dirt and dried blood. Her muzzle hung low, as if lifting it required more energy than she possessed. One of her eyes appeared clouded, possibly blind. A strange silence fell over the barn. Yes." The auctioneer cleared his throat, embarrassed. "We have an animal here that requires some special care. This could be a good opportunity for someone with experience in herd rehabilitation." One laugh started in the crowd, then another, then 20. "What a waste of auction space!" someone shouted. Why didn't they send her to slaughter? Another voice asked. The auctioneer forced a professional smile. Well, let's start with an opening bid of $3,000 for this specimen. Nobody raised their hand. $3,000 for a cow that looked like she was waiting to die? Even for an auction where unexpected bids were common, this was absurd. Okay then, let's go lower. $1,500. More silence. The auctioneer's assistant whispered something into his ear. The auctioneer nodded, his face reflecting embarrassment mixed with genuine sympathy. Looks like we have some documented health issues with this one. Let's start at $500, just $500. That's when David Mitchell raised his hand. The reaction was instant and visceral. The laughter became guffaws. A man next to him, Travis, owner of the neighboring ranch and known for his arrogance, could barely breathe from laughing. David! David! That cow is literally dying! Brother, you've got 15 healthy animals at home. Why waste money on that? Asked another, mixing amusement with genuine pity. Susan pulled gently on David's arm, a subtle gesture that meant, it's still not too late to back out. Nobody will judge you. Well, they will, but less than if you keep going. But David kept his hand raised. The auctioneer, surprised and clearly relieved to have any offer at all, accelerated the process. $500. Do I hear 600? Nobody. There wasn't a second bidder in 100 miles. Okay, I'll close it at 500. Going once, going twice. David felt every eye in the crowd turn toward him. And in that moment, as the auctioneer raised his gavel, something remarkable occurred to him. Something that nobody else in that arena had noticed. Something that only a former large animal veterinarian, now 58 and obsessive about bloodlines, could have spotted. The cow had markings, not the obvious markings of neglect, but the markings of a specific lineage, a marking on her ear indicating origin, a bone structure, despite the thinness, that suggested pedigree. And most importantly, that clouded eye wasn't blindness. It was the exact physical characteristic of a bloodline so rare that most people believed it was extinct. Going 3 times, sold! Congratulations, Mr. Mitchell! The gavel came down. The cow was theirs. As the auction staff guided the skeletal animal toward the loading area, the crowd around David and Susan erupted in commentary. What a waste! 7 years saving for that? That cow won't last 2 weeks. David, you should have talked to me first. I know some good vets in Billings who could have told you this was a bad investment. Travis, the same man who'd laughed the loudest, approached David with an expression of concerned friendship. Man, I've known you for 35 years. You're a sensible guy. What happened to you? That cow is sick. You know that, right? She might have something contagious. David simply smiled, a calm, patient smile of someone who knew something you didn't. We'll see, Travis. We'll see. Susan, beside him, kept her hands clasped and a small smile on her lips. She had learned over 2.5 decades with David that when he had that look of quiet certainty, it was best to trust him. But trust didn't mean it would be easy. As the couple loaded the cow into their trailer and drove away from the auction toward their modest ranch on the outskirts of Billings, Montana, the first waves of judgment were already circulating through the community. At the coffee shop downtown where locals gathered before work, David and Susan bought a sick cow for $500. Just one, and a dying one at that. He's probably losing his mind, getting old, you know. On Facebook, because even small Montana towns had social media now, photos from the auction appeared. You gotta see this. People make the worst decisions sometimes. The comments exploded. Some laughed. Some offered unsolicited advice. A few defended David based on nothing but pure optimism. For David and Susan, though, those first days were about work. The cow, which they decided to name Hope, a name that made several people laugh when they later found out, was brought to their property with careful handling. David, despite his 58 years and occasional back pain, worked like a man half his age. He built a specialized shelter, protected from wind and Montana's harsh weather, He hired an equine and livestock vet, not his friend because friends would have asked questions, for a complete checkup. The results came back in 10 days. Hope had severe malnutrition. She had a lung infection that was treatable. She had a skin condition that would disappear with proper care and medication. But, and this was the part that made David smile, her reproductive system, her immune markers, her genetic indicators, everything was perfect. And that clouded eye? It wasn't blindness. It was a genetic marker specific to a rare Holstein bloodline, nearly extinct in America. A bloodline that, in international markets, was worth a fortune. While all this was happening, the town continued laughing. The months unfolded in a pattern. Work, and even more work. David woke at 3:30 a.m. He prepared special food that the veterinarian had prescribed for Hope. He added vitamins and supplements to every meal. He treated the skin infections with expensive medications. He talked to the animal. Yes, the solitary rancher really did talk to his cow, like he was speaking to an old friend who had fallen on hard times. Susan managed the finances. She kept every receipt, every veterinary note, every medication purchase. She had a small notebook where she recorded Hope's weight every week. The cow began gaining weight slowly. Her ribs stopped being visible. Her clouded eye began to shine with more vitality. Her coat, which had been dull and colorless, started to gain the luster that only a healthy animal possesses. Travis saw her once when he visited David for other reasons. He stepped into Hope's shelter and blinked, surprised. "Whoa! She's improved a lot." "Yes," answered David calmly, brushing the animal's back. "Sometimes things that seem useless just need someone who believes in them." "Even so, David. One single cow? What are you expecting to gain from one single animal?" David smiled but didn't answer. Because the answer, the real answer, hadn't arrived yet. But it was coming. Months and a half after the auction, on a night that David would never forget, Hope did something that the town could never have predicted. She became pregnant, not by accident, not by negligence, but because David had, weeks earlier, contacted a breeder in Wisconsin, a man who had a bull, a single bull in all of North America, who was direct bloodline to Hope's rare genetics. A bull whose offspring were sold for tens of thousands of dollars in international markets. And yes, that breeder had charged an astronomical amount for the artificial insemination service, but David had saved for that too. When the pregnancy test came back positive, David and Susan embraced in their kitchen, tears streaming down both their faces. They had gambled everything, their savings, their credit, their reputation, all on a cow without value that everyone had ridiculed. And now, that cow was carrying what could be their future, the future of their ranch, the future of everything they had built in 35 years of marriage. Hope's pregnancy progressed perfectly, and when, 9 months later, she gave birth to a heifer, a female calf, which was more valuable than a male, David simply sat in the straw beside the newborn animal and wept. Because now, the cow that had been ridiculed, the cow that everyone had laughed at, the cow that was worthless and a waste of time, had just produced an animal whose genetic value was estimated at more than $60,000, and potentially much, much more. The first signs that something extraordinary was happening appeared subtly, but with increasing clarity. 1 week after the calf's birth, which David and Susan named Diamond, a veterinarian from the University of Montana's Animal Science Department appeared at the ranch. His name was Dr. Patterson, and he was arguably the most respected cattle geneticist in the entire Pacific Northwest. He had come because David's longtime friend, the vet who had done Hope's initial checkup, had called him. The conversation had been simple but urgent. "You need to come look at this cow." Dr. Patterson spent 3 hours examining Hope. He took samples. He photographed her from every angle. He asked David question after question about her lineage, her health history, her blood work. Finally, he sat down in David's kitchen with a cup of coffee, and his hands were visibly shaking. "David, in my 30 years of studying cattle genetics, I have never seen anything like this. Do you understand what you have here?" David kept his expression neutral, waiting. This cow carries genetic markers from the original Frisian bloodline imported to America in the 1890s. That specific bloodline was lost. We thought it was completely lost. The last documented animal from that line died in 1987. And yet, here she is, carrying genes that should have disappeared decades ago. Susan, who was listening from the doorway, felt her knees weaken slightly. "Doctor," Patterson continued, "and her calf, the heifer. If the genetics breed true, and I suspect they will, you're looking at an animal whose pedigree could revolutionize the entire American dairy industry. Universities would pay hundreds of thousands of dollars for the right to study her. International breeders would kill for access to her genetics." David breathed slowly. How much would she be worth? Realistically? Dr. Patterson paused, choosing his words carefully. As a breeding animal with documented genetic significance, somewhere between $150,000 and $250,000. Maybe more, depending on how the breeding programs develop. And that's just the starting point. If you establish a breeding program with her descendants, you could be looking at generational wealth. The room went quiet. David and Susan did not immediately announce their good fortune. Instead, they worked quietly. David contacted the University of Montana. He spoke with Dr. Patterson about establishing a formal research partnership. He reached out to the American Holsteins Association, the official registry for dairy cattle in the United States. Within 2 months, Hope had been officially registered as a rare genetic specimen. Her bloodline was documented, her genetic markers were cataloged. And the Holsteins Association issued a statement that was circulated through agricultural publications nationwide. A lost bloodline rediscovered, the Mitchell Ranch in Montana, has registered a Holstein cow carrying genetic material previously thought to be extinct. This discovery could have significant implications for the future of American dairy cattle. The article was published in Hoard's Dairyman, the most prestigious agricultural magazine in America. Then came the phone calls. First from the University of Wisconsin, one of the nation's premier agricultural schools. They wanted to discuss breeding partnerships. Then from breeding operations in California, Texas, and New York, all wanting to negotiate access to Diamond's genetics. Then from a documentary producer in Los Angeles who wanted to film David and Susan's story. The small Montana town where David and Susan lived began to shift, almost imperceptibly at first, then dramatically. Travis, who had laughed the loudest at the auction, appeared at David's ranch one morning with a sheepish expression. "David, I saw the article in Hoard's. I owe you an apology. I didn't believe in you." David, who was mending a fence, stopped and turned to face his old friend. "Travis, you didn't know. Nobody knew. That's okay." "Still," continued Travis, "I'm prepared to offer something. I want to breed some of my cattle with Diamond's bloodline. I understand you'd need compensation, but I'm willing to negotiate seriously." David smiled. "Let's talk about it." But the real transformation came when the local newspaper, the Billings Gazette, published a feature story on their front page. From mockery to millions, how a Montana couple's faith in a dying cow created an agricultural breakthrough. The article told the entire story. The auction, the ridicule, the patient work, the genetic discovery. It was a human interest story with the kind of emotional arc that newspapers loved. The day that article was published, 3 things happened. Every person in Billings who had laughed at David and Susan at the coffee shop, on Facebook, or in casual conversation suddenly remembered that they had always believed David was a genius. David received calls from veterinary schools, agricultural programs, and research institutions across the country. The town's entire narrative about the Mitchells shifted from those crazy people to our local heroes. 6 months after Dr. Patterson's visit, David and Susan attended the Montana Ranchers Association annual conference in Missoula. They didn't go as attendees. They went as speakers. David was invited to present on recognizing hidden genetic value in overlooked animals. Susan was invited to discuss financial planning for unexpected agricultural success. The conference room was packed. Ranchers from across Montana, Wyoming, and Idaho filled every seat, and when David walked to the podium, the applause was thunderous. He told the story, all of it, the auction, the $500, the laughter, the work, the discovery, and he said something that would be quoted in agricultural publications for years to come. I want to say something to the people in this room. Many of you knew about hope. Many of you doubted me. Some of you laughed. That's not a criticism. It's human nature. We judge things we don't understand. We dismiss things that challenge our expectations. But here's what I learned. The world is full of hidden value. Not just in animals, in people, in ideas, in opportunities that everyone else has passed over. The question isn't why hope seemed worthless. The question is why we all have become so good at not seeing value in the first place. The room was completely silent. Meanwhile, the financial reality of David and Susan's situation was becoming extraordinary. Diamond had been bred 3 times, producing 3 offspring, all of which showed the same rare genetic markers. Each breeding agreement was worth between $50,000 and $75,000. The University of Montana had offered David a formal position as a genetic consultant, paying $120,000 annually. International breeders were inquiring about exporting Diamond's offspring, which could add another $200,000 annually to their income. Within a year, David and Susan went from a modest veterinary supply business, generating maybe $100,000 annually, to a situation where they were making $400,000 per year from their ranch alone. But something unexpected happened. Instead of jealousy, David and Susan found something more complex: revelation. The ranchers who had mocked them now wanted to learn from them. Travis didn't just want to breed with Diamond, he wanted David to help him audit his entire herd for hidden genetic potential. Other ranchers did the same. David and Susan started a consulting business on the side. They began going to auctions, not to buy, but to teach other ranchers how to see, how to recognize genetic potential, how to look beyond the obvious. And slowly, quietly, Montana became known as a center of agricultural genetic innovation. The annual livestock auction at Rocky Mountain Livestock Exchange was bustling as usual when David and Susan walked through the doors. This time, they weren't there to buy. The auctioneer saw them and immediately called them up to the platform. Ladies and gentlemen, we have some very special guests here today. These are David and Susan Mitchell. Maybe you know them from the news? 2 years ago, right here in this very arena, David made a bid that everyone thought was crazy. He bought a cow for $500 that nobody wanted, and that decision changed everything. The crowd erupted in applause. David, slightly uncomfortable with the attention, simply nodded. Susan squeezed his hand. The auctioneer continued, "Today I want to ask David to share some wisdom. David, what would you say to anyone here who is considering taking a chance on something unconventional?" David walked to the microphone. He looked out at the sea of faces, some familiar, some new. Some of the people who had laughed at him 2 years ago were right there in the front row. He took a moment before speaking. "I'll tell you exactly what I would say. First, never give up on something you believe in, even when everyone ridicules you. Second, and this is more important, be careful about judging things you don't understand. We judge what we fear. We ridicule what challenges our worldview. But maybe, just maybe, the thing we're mocking is only incomprehensible because we're not ready to see it yet. That doesn't make it worthless. It just makes us not ready." He paused, then smiled. "And one more thing. That cow standing in lot 67 that nobody wants? Maybe that's the one you should be paying attention to." The crowd laughed, but this time it was a different kind of laughter. It was the laughter of people who had learned something. 3 years after Hope was purchased at the auction for $500, David Mitchell sat in his office, a space he never thought he would have, and stared at a document that made him deeply uncomfortable. It was an offer. Not just any offer. An offer from Genetica Global, one of the largest agricultural biotechnology companies in the world, headquartered in San Francisco. They wanted to buy exclusive breeding rights to Diamond and all of her offspring for the next 15 years. The number on the page made David's hands tremble slightly. $8.5 million, $8.5 million. He had read it 5 times, and each time the number felt less real, not more. Susan had seen it too, and for the first time since this whole journey began, he had seen fear in her eyes. Not fear of losing the money, fear of what accepting it would mean. Because there was a catch. There was always a catch. Genetica Global wanted Diamond moved to a facility in California. They wanted to control all breeding decisions. They wanted to own the genetic legacy that David and Susan had built. In exchange, they would pay the massive sum, plus royalties from any offspring sold internationally. David could sell. He could take the money, set up his family for generations, retire at 61, and live a comfortable life. But he couldn't sell Hope. The document made that clear. Hope herself would remain the property of Genetica Global under a permanent lease agreement. David and Susan could visit, could care for her, but she would effectively belong to the company. For 3 days, David didn't tell anyone. He kept the document in a locked drawer in his office, hidden even from Susan initially, because he knew what he had to do, and he knew it would disappoint people who expected him to take the money. On the 4th day, he showed the letter to Susan. She read it slowly, carefully, her eyes moving across each line. When she finished, she looked up at him and simply said, "What do you want to do?" "I want to say no," David answered. "But I'm scared. I'm scared I'm making a mistake. I'm scared I'm leaving money on the table that could secure our children's future. I'm scared I'm being foolish." Susan set the document down on the kitchen table and took his hand. "Then let's think about what we'd be giving up. Not money. I mean, yes, money is important. But what else?" David thought about it. "Freedom. The ability to make decisions about Diamond's future based on what's right for her, not what maximizes profit. The ability to breed her with other rare bloodlines. The ability to help other ranchers discover hidden value in their own herds." Susan squeezed his hand. "Then I think you know what you have to do." David's response to Genetica Global was brief and respectful. "Thank you for your generous offer. After careful consideration, we have decided to decline. We believe that the genetic legacy we've built with Diamond should remain under our stewardship, where breeding decisions can be made based on the health and well-being of the animal, rather than purely financial optimization. We appreciate your interest and wish you well with your other projects." The response from Genetica Global came within 24 hours. They increased their offer to $12 million. David declined again. They offered $15 million. He declined. By the 5th offer, $20 million, the company's tone changed. Their letters became less friendly, more businesslike. They essentially said, "We will find another way to acquire the genetics you possess, whether through your cooperation or not." It was a subtle threat. David showed the letter to Travis, who had become a close friend and advisor over the past 3 years. "You should take it," Travis said immediately. $20 million, David. That's generational wealth, that's your grandchildren's college funds, that's security. "At what cost?" asked David. "What do you mean, at what cost? You're rich. You win." David shook his head. "But I don't get to choose anymore. Once I sign that contract, I've surrendered the ability to make decisions. I become a hired consultant for a company that owns the most important thing I've ever discovered. Is that winning?" Travis was quiet for a long moment. "No," he finally said. "I guess it's not." Instead of taking the money, David and Susan did something unexpected. They started the Mitchell Genetic Heritage Institute, a nonprofit organization dedicated to preserving rare livestock bloodlines and helping ranchers identify hidden genetic potential in their herds. They used a portion of their earnings from breeding partnerships to fund it. They recruited Dr. Patterson from the University of Montana as chief scientific advisor. They brought in veterinarians, geneticists, and agricultural specialists from across the country. And they made one revolutionary decision. They would teach other people how to see what David had seen in Hope. The institute began offering weekend workshops. They traveled to agricultural conferences. They published research papers. They created an online database where ranchers could submit photos of animals they thought might have rare genetics, and the institute would perform initial assessments. It was exhausting work. It was also profoundly fulfilling in a way that the Genetica Global money never could have been. Within 2 years, the Mitchell Institute had helped identify 17 animals with rare genetic markers across 12 states. Some belonged to small family ranches struggling to stay afloat. Some belonged to large operations that had never even known what they possessed. And slowly, a movement began. Ranchers started looking differently at the animals they owned, started questioning their assumptions, started seeing potential where they had only seen problems before. David received letters from people whose lives had been transformed by the Institute's work. "Dear Mr. Mitchell, I attended your workshop last year, and you taught me to look at my herd differently. I found what I thought was a sick calf in my barn, something I was going to send to auction. I almost didn't attend your workshop, but I did, and I learned what to look for. That calf turned out to have a rare bloodline worth thousands of dollars. I've used that money to expand my ranch, hire help, and actually spend time with my family again instead of just surviving paycheck to paycheck. Thank you for teaching me to see."
Sarah Mitchell, no relation, Wyoming. These letters, dozens of them, then hundreds, lined the walls of David's office. 5 years after the original auction, David was invited to speak at the American Agricultural Economics Association annual conference in Chicago. The keynote address: 3,000 agricultural professionals, business leaders, and policymakers gathering to hear him speak about the true value of seeing genetic heritage and economic transformation in rural America.
David stood at the podium, looking out at the enormous crowd, and he told the story. Not the simplified version that had appeared in magazines, the real story, including his temptation to sell, his doubts, his fears. "I want to be honest with you," he said, his voice steady but emotional. 2 years ago, I was offered $20 million for the genetic rights to Diamond. $20 million. Do you know how much that is? That's more money than my family would earn in 10 lifetimes of normal work. He paused. And I said no, not because I'm virtuous or noble, not because I'm above money, but because I realized something during that process. The most valuable things in life aren't for sale. He talked about Hope's journey, but he also talked about something deeper, about how America had become so focused on short-term profit that we had stopped seeing long-term value. How we had become so efficient at extracting wealth that we had forgotten about creating legacy. Every single one of you in this room has made decisions based on maximizing return on investment. That's what we're trained to do. But what if we trained ourselves to ask a different question? Not, what is this worth? But what could this become? What potential are we overlooking? He shared statistics from the Mitchell Institute. Showed how identifying hidden genetic potential had helped 73 different ranching families increase their income by an average of 30%. How it had kept family farms operating that otherwise would have gone under. The economic value of seeing correctly is massive, but there's something even more valuable: the human value. The value of a father who can work less and spend more time with his children. The value of a community that believes in each other instead of competing ruthlessly. The value of preserving something rare and beautiful instead of destroying it for quick profit. When he finished, the applause lasted for nearly 5 minutes. But more importantly, something shifted in that room. Agricultural companies began calling the Mitchell Institute, asking how they could partner. Universities reached out, wanting to establish research collaborations. Government agencies started discussing policy changes around agricultural preservation. The quiet movement that David and Susan had started was becoming a wave. 7 years after the original auction, something remarkable happened. Genetica Global went bankrupt, not because of David, that would have been too much of a coincidence, but because their agricultural division, which depended heavily on patents and exclusive breeding rights, failed to innovate effectively. Meanwhile, smaller, more nimble operations, many of them inspired by David's work, were outcompeting them. And in the liquidation of Genetica Global's assets, something unexpected occurred. David received a letter from a lawyer in San Francisco. Inside was an invitation to bid on genetic materials that Genetica Global had acquired over the years, including some related to rare Holstein bloodlines. The company wanted to sell to fund their bankruptcy proceedings. David attended the auction. So did Susan, and they brought Dr. Patterson with them. When they saw what was being auctioned, they found something extraordinary: genetic samples and breeding records from 3 cattle that shared genetic markers with Diamond. Animals that had been owned by Genetica Global clients in different parts of the country. David and Susan won the auction for the genetic materials and breeding records, paying far less than Genetica Global had originally paid. It was $800,000. Expensive, but nothing compared to the $20 million that had been offered to David years earlier. But what they had purchased was something much more valuable than money: the ability to expand Diamond's genetic legacy in ways that would serve the agricultural community rather than a single company's profit margins. 10 years after that first fateful day at Rocky Mountain Livestock Exchange, David and Susan returned to the auction barn. They weren't there to bid this time. They were there because they had been asked to name the prize for the auction's grand raffle, a special honor given to the auction house's most important patrons, and they had decided on something perfect. They donated Hope herself, or more precisely, they donated a breeding partnership with Hope, allowing one lucky rancher to breed one animal with the legendary cow. The raffle ticket cost $5, and all proceeds would go to the Mitchell Genetic Heritage Institute. Over 3,000 tickets were sold. A man named Robert Chen, a second-generation Chinese-American rancher from Oregon who had almost lost his farm before attending a Mitchell Institute workshop, won the raffle. When his name was called, he came to the platform, tears streaming down his face. David embraced him. "This is your moment," David said. "This is what winning really looks like." Robert looked at Hope, now 14 years old, her coat still glossy and healthy, her presence commanding the attention of everyone in the barn, and he wept. "I almost gave up," Robert said. "My father would have been disappointed. But then I attended your workshop. You taught me how to see value in my herd. I found 3 animals with rare genetics. That discovery saved my farm. It saved my family." David nodded, understanding completely. That night, David and Susan sat in their hotel room in Billings, looking out at the Montana landscape they had lived in their entire lives. So much had changed, and yet so much remained the same. "Do you regret it?" asked Susan, "turning down all that money?" David thought about the question carefully. "Every single day I'm tempted to regret it. Every time I pay a bill, I think about what that $20 million could have done. But then I think about Robert Chen. I think about the 73 ranching families we've helped. I think about the genetic materials we've preserved. I think about the fact that Hope, that beautiful, miraculous animal, is still alive and still contributing to the world instead of being locked away in some corporate breeding facility." He paused. "No, I don't regret it. This is better than money. This is legacy." 12 years after the auction, David received a phone call that surprised him. It was Travis, his old neighbor, the man who had laughed the loudest at the auction. "David, I need to tell you something," Travis said, his voice emotional. "I'm retiring, selling the ranch, and I wanted you to know why." "Why?" asked David. "Because I've been thinking about what you told me years ago, about how the things we ridicule are often just things we don't understand. And I realized something. I've spent my whole life chasing money, competing with other ranchers, always trying to beat someone. But I watched you build something different. You built something that lifted other people up." Travis took a breath. "I want to do that too. So I'm going to volunteer full-time with the Mitchell Institute. No salary, just doing the work, teaching people to see what they're missing." David couldn't speak for a moment. "Travis, you don't have to do that. You could retire, enjoy your life." "I know," interrupted Travis, "but I watched you turn down $20 million because you had something more important. I'm trying to understand what that feels like. I'm trying to become the kind of person who can see value instead of just extracting it." After the call ended, David sat in his office for a long time simply thinking. He thought about the $500 cow. He thought about the ridicule. He thought about the years of work. He thought about the offers that had tempted him. He thought about the choice to say no. And he thought about something that nobody could have predicted, that in turning down enormous wealth, he had somehow created something far more valuable, a movement, a way of seeing. A community of people who had learned that value isn't always obvious, that potential isn't always apparent, and that sometimes the most worthless thing in the room is actually the most precious. Hope lived to be 22 years old, an exceptionally long life for a dairy cow. When she passed away, it was on a spring morning, peacefully, in the pasture she had grazed in for 16 years. The Mitchell Institute held a memorial service. Over 200 people attended: ranchers, veterinarians, scientists, policymakers, people whose lives had been changed by what Hope had taught them. David gave a short speech. Hope came to us as waste. Everyone said she was worthless. But she wasn't worthless. We just weren't ready to see her value. And I think about that a lot now. I think about how many times we dismiss something, or someone, without really looking. How many opportunities we pass by because they don't fit our expectations. How many possibilities we destroy because we're too quick to judge. He looked out at the assembled people. Hope taught us all something. She taught us to look twice. She taught us that value isn't always obvious. And she taught us that sometimes, when we choose to believe in something that the world has given up on, we can change everything.